Please, mama, can't you see I've always tried to please? I wore ribbons and jewelry and makeup and perfume and dresses down to my knees. You said that it's a phase, just something I'd outgrow. But I got a girlfriend and she's got a lawn that I'd sure like to mow. Go on and wish that Brad Pitt would come along, but I prefer Madonna in a lacy thong. 'Cause I'm a lesbian, I don't like nothing swinging between their legs.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. In relation to being long-standing, I had tea with my mother last night and I was telling her about this event, and she said, "But why are you speaking?" And I was like, well, I'm, speaking about my involvement in the lesbian community over the years. And she said, "Yeah, but not 50 years. I said, "No, I'm 60. I didn't come out when I was 50. I said, "But," and she said, "And the what festival?" I said, "The Bjarne Festival." "What's that?" I said, "It's a festival for older people." She said, "You're not old. I'm old. I'm 87. I said, "Mum, if you want to come along and do the talking instead of me, you'll be more than welcome to." She didn't take me up on it, but she really couldn't get her head around the fact I was good. Why did they ask you? I said, "Because I'm old. Because I am now old. This is what old looks like." Anyway, it's really lovely to be invited here, and it's very moving to see some of these pictures, because for me, and I suppose for any of us who are in my kind of age group, a whole lot of this is our personal history, and it's complicated. We have complicated relationships with all the people in these pictures. we have complicated lives, so, I'm going to skip over that very quickly and just say it's nice to take a moment for uncomplicated appreciation of how much our community has achieved. Before most of you people arrived, I was here this afternoon and I spoke with a group of young people who were here from Britain as guests of, I'm going to say from England and Scotland, actually, as guests of Belong To, about some of this stuff and the history and what the environment was like when I came out. I came out in 1982 and I was 19. And the lesbian community was completely invisible. I was asked to write something for the first Carlow Pride. I'm from Carlow, which, believe me, was the arsehole of the universe in the 1970s. I know there are other people who would claim that there are other towns that are arseholes of the universe, but I'm going to have to put my vote for Carlow, okay? And I literally never heard the word lesbian until I was maybe about 15. And of course, when I did hear it, it was being used about me. I was trying to try and work out what it meant. I looked it up in the dictionary, and it wasn't in the dictionary. And at home, and I looked at it in the dictionary in school, which was obviously also an expurgated edition, and it wasn't in there. And I remember going down to Mrs. McKenna's bookshop on the main street in Carlow Town and going through the dictionaries frantically looking for lesbian, and eventually found a definition. And the definition said, "an unnatural woman." Oh, that was it. That was the entire definition. I really was none the wiser going home than I was when I arrived. So, that was the silence. I was going to school in the 1970s, and people talk about the 1970s in popular culture as the kind of heyday of androgyny in pop music particularly. And it was, but we could not read the code. One of the things I mentioned to the young people here earlier, I would be hopeful, because you're all Irish, that most of you would know about what happened in Fairview Park in 1982, the year I came out, which was that Declan Flynn was murdered there. And the trial of the killers of Declan Flynn was a huge galvanising event for Actually, not just for LGBT people, I think, but for anybody who had been persecuted in that very rigid Ireland for their difference. Because the fact that the killers were freed on suspended sentences really meant that our lives were worth nothing. That was our status at the time, that it was understandable that people would kill us, would be unable to tolerate being in the same spaces as some would kill us. And thank God, I think, that galvanised the community in the way that it did, and good did come out of this extreme evil. But the point of me telling this story was to illustrate the ignorance of people in Ireland at that time, and young people in Ireland at that time, about gay lives, about LGBT lives. The men who were released from prison that day, having killed Declan Flynn, returned to their community where a victory march was held, and they were marched around the community held aloft on shoulders. And the people who carried them around were singing, "We are the champions," a Queen song, right? But I don't think any of us knew that Freddie Mercury was gay. You know, the band was called Queen, and he looked like he did, and he acted like he did, but like you had to come out before you kind of cracked the code. It was like a secret code, and you spent the first couple of years after you came out of the closet, sitting in rooms, you know, watching TV programs with friends and stuff, and going, and she's gay, and he's gay. It was a kind of an induction that you got, but all of this was secret until you came out yourself, yeah? So it was actually, if you look at any of the events, particularly in the 70s and 80s that are recounted on the walls here, it was dangerous to do those things, and it was an act of extreme bravery. But I think we would be fooling ourselves if we thought that those problems were all in the past, because the pendulum swings in both directions. And we are in fact living in a time when LGBT people and our freedoms are in fact under pretty sustained attack. From the usual suspects who have been, finding a new flag to march behind every few years, and currently, you know, they're very targeted at trans people because they have identified trans people, they think they have identified trans people as a very weak segment of the population, and that if they can split them out, they can undo all of our progress also, because these things are very intimately connected with each other. And I think it's really important. Our whole persecution was on the basis of difference. I have put a massive chunk of my life's energy. I came out almost 41 years ago. For five of those years, no gay pride marches happened. So that brings you down to 35 or 36 of them. I think I was involved in 30, right, in one way or another, out of all of that. So it's very much the story of my life, and the reason why I have been drawn to pride. I'm an odd person, do you know what I mean? I drifted in and out of a lot of different groups, and the lesbian community that I came out into was very wonderful, very creative in many ways, but it was also very conformist, and it was very difficult for people who didn't fit in. And I didn't fit in. I never felt that I fitted in, and I never would have fitted in. And we were still some way away from the realization that our liberation lay in not fitting in. we were going to have to get rid of that and go, we're no pride, and we were going to be okay. That's my belief anyway. But it was very difficult, and I moved, like as many of us moved, between the women-only activism that was going on in the lesbian community, the mixed lesbian and gay activism of things like the Dublin Lesbian Gay Collective, which I'm very proud to have been quite briefly involved in, but if you were to do a kind of a family tree of LGBT projects in Ireland, a phenomenal number of them would go back to the Dublin Lesbian Gay Collective, which was a very small number of people. And also the reproductive rights movement, which is, you know, feminism in Ireland has always been all about reproductive rights. And it's interesting now as well that we see that the same people who are coming for LGBT rights are of course coming for reproductive rights. They always have done. You know, we've pulled the pendulum in our direction, and now they're working very, very hard to pull it back. So, you know, there's so much I could say, but it's all up here on the walls for you to read. And you know, my only complaint about this, I'd love to see more pictures. It needs a bigger space and a lot more pictures. I think this kind of archiving and documenting our history work is incredibly important. But I also think what we need to do is, you know, we need to get involved in intergenerational projects. We need a lot of intergenerational projects in the community at this point. The younger LGBT people need to be working with the older LGBT people, and vice versa. I'm hopeful that this is some of what you're going to be talking about on Monday. I'm hopeful that that's the direction we're going to see Outhouse coming in. I know one other thing I wanted to mention: the people that sneer at us these days, of whom there are many, you know, the ones who like to call us, you know, wokey, this or that. They try to act like an intersectional understanding of oppression is new, and it certainly isn't new. And the women's movement that I got involved in over 40 years ago was very aware of intersecting axes of oppression, and I'm very glad about that, and I'm very proud of that. I was 19 years old. I'd been in Dublin for 2 years, kind of looking for the gay community but it was invisible. It was even there was in Dublin magazine, was the listings magazine at the time.
Back page.
Yes, it was in there, but it was in code.
Yeah.
It was in code until somebody pointed it out to you. It was completely
It was very
invisible.
interesting because it said women's disco.
Yes.
And I just went, women's disco.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
couldn't
What is
understand, really, didn't know
Yeah.
what that meant.
No.
And called it on one night, but there was a male bouncer outside.
Yes.
And I was all dressed up, raring to go. One that I'd fallen in love with, who was straight, told me about this place. It's a place called the Women's Disco under, where was it? The Pembroke.
Yeah, the Pembroke, yes.
So it took me 2 weeks before to get muster of courage, but it was the back of the In Dublin magazine.
Yeah. Well, my mother was a journalist, and she received a review copy of the Irish Women's Diary. Do you all remember the Irish Women's Diary? When I was the first year it came out, I think I was probably about 15 or 16, and I devoured this diary. I read it from the start to the finish, and the Lesbian Lines number was in it. The Lesbian Lines has been talked about a lot, and of course it's very important, and we need to keep talking about it. And I think the Dublin Lesbian Line has done amazingly to survive as well as it has done, and to diversify its services and bring its services into the 21st century in the way that it has done. I really hope that we're all very solidly behind the Dublin Lesbian Line, because they very much deserve our support. But I wrote down the number of the Dublin Lesbian Line, and there was a few contacts pages in the diary. Now it was already in there in the listings, but I transferred that number. I just wrote LL. And I wrote the number, which was 710-608.
Yeah, it was.
Yes.
It was 67178.
No, the 6 came later. They only added in when the numbers became 7 digits rather than 6.
That's the 6 digits.
Yes, they were still 6 digits. But I wrote that into my diary, and I transcribed it into every diary that I carried for the next 4 or 5 years. I never rang it, but it meant something to me to know it was there, you know? So I have been vague in this kind of unfocused ADHD way, kind of looking for the LGBT community in some I accidentally rambled into the Viking once. You remember the Viking? The Viking was a bar on Dame Street. A gay bar in that really all its clientele was
Just
gay.
next door to the Olympian.
I got barred out of there once for sharing a stool with a woman who pecked me on the cheek. Right? And I got thrown out onto the street. None of your old hugger-muggering in here.
Which calls to mind, and I don't want to distract anybody, do you remember the pub zaps we used to do?
Yes, exactly.
Pub zap. Yes, you go ahead and tell them.
Well,
Because we take it for granted.
I was never on any of them. I know that they happened,
Yes,
but
I
I mean,
was, and we
the only
were
one I was on was the
Yeah.
kiss-in the Parliament Inn when it became the Turk's Head.
Oh, yeah.
That was the only one I was on. But yeah, there was all kinds of little sort of revenge actions and things that we did to set the record straight. The history is much too complicated to be covered in an event like this. We would need a whole festival to reclaim just if we were to talk about just the lesbian history of, say, just that period in the early 80s. The Irish Women's Centre was a huge loss. The Hirschfeld Centre was a huge loss. I'm struck in many ways by, we had nothing in the way of government funding or anything like that. Nothing here was funded. We were illegal, we were criminal, we didn't expect to get any funding. But accommodation was cheap and plentiful in Dublin at that time. And, the Women's Centre on Dame Street, that could happen because it was belonged by CIE, it was owned by CIE, it was scheduled to be knocked down for a bus station, as was the whole area at that time. And you could get a caretaker's agreement with a nominal rent for those buildings, and all kinds of creativity. The Temple Bar area as such did not exist. The Temple Bar area happened because of that. If you want a flourishing art scene, if you want flourishing community sector, people having access to cheap property is really a big part of it. And I'm struck in many ways by how impoverished our communities are now. But also we are less dependent on all being physically together in the same time and place, because technology has given us some gifts too. So I really wish there was I think there are historical reasons why Outhouse hasn't been able to be the unifying thing that it should have been for the LGBT community. I hope we can move forward and that something, it may be Outhouse or it may be something else, but that something becomes that unifying space where we can have these conversations across age lines, across gender lines, and make the kind of flourishing community that I have been working for and hoping for over 40 years, and a few of those here who I won't embarrass by saying that they're even older than me.
We remember you well.
The unfold dream, I'm still here. But some have been working on, as it said, for 50 years. And there are others, there are stories that go further back than that, but they were very, very isolated little pockets of resistance and connection. So, I'm here with an optimistic outlook that we're going to move forward together. I think COVID crystallized a lot of things for us, and I hope. Oh yes, I know why I mentioned. Sorry, I'm terrible. Izzy, this is your last one. Yes, trying to get your attention. Sorry, this is my last one. When I was saying about the intersectional women's movement that I came out into, I couldn't find the gay community anywhere. And I read a letter in the Irish Times in September 1983. This is how I finally found the dykes, right? I read a letter which was not about anything to do about lesbian politics, and this is why I say that intersectional politics helped me, because it brought me to the lesbians, which was a big thing. There was a letter in the Irish Times from Ita Gannon advertising a public meeting in the Women's Centre, right? And what the meeting was Nan Joyce, who had contested. Nan Joyce was the first traveller to contest an election in Ireland. and she was an incredibly good speaker. I'd seen her on the Late Late Show and stuff. She really did quite amazing work back in the early 80s. And Nan Joyce was speaking in the Women's Centre, and I arrived and I was late, as I always am, and I had to sit on a chair, and some time later, the woman, even later than I was, the woman who would later become, about 2 weeks later, become my first lover, came in equally late, and I moved over on my chair and let her share the chair with me, and that was it. I was out. But it was because we were all gathered there. There was a lot of lesbian women gathered there to hear this travel woman talking about her politics and her community's experience. And, you know, that spirit has always been strong in our community. Our community has always been aware of, you know, dyke activists had big battles about outhouse and the outhouse before this, and Dublin AIDS Alliance when they moved into inaccessible buildings. I have been saying for 40 years, and I'm now getting to the stage where stairs are starting to be a little bit more of a challenge than they used to be, but I have been saying for 40 years we're going to end up being locked out of the infrastructure that we created ourselves by age and disability, because we didn't pay enough attention to what disability activists were saying to us 40 years ago. But, as I say, I want to end on an optimistic note. We're gathered here together. There's a lovely assembly of people, all different ages, all different kind of histories and backgrounds. I really hope that we're going to come together, and the next 50 years is going to be the 50 years when we make everything really happen. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're gonna have to ask me. You're gonna have to ask me. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you slowly, till you're just begging me to hold you. Yeah, whatever you want. Whatever you want. But you're gonna have to ask me. Your mouth waters stretched out on my bed. Your fingers are trembling.